And I think this actually requires a shift in our own ways of thinking about politics, because I think there's a sense in which we have absorbed an individualistic approach to politics. I see this a lot of people on the left seeing ourselves as heroes, saving victims. I think this is what that man who I spoke to on the doorstep was really cynical about, because it feeds into a lack of agency. If you approach someone and say, I'm here to save you, that feeds into that very sense of powerlessness that is at the root of their political alienation to begin with. So I think this is the challenge that we face today. We need to abandon the politics of hero and victims and start empowering working people to, in the words of the Brexiteers, take back control of their own lives. And if you think about it, this is the only way that the left has ever won political change in the past. Left politics did not emerge from clever leftist intellectuals going to working class communities and saying, have you considered forming a union to shift the balance of power away from capital and towards labor? No, left politics emerged out of people's struggles for a better life.
Welcome to Perspectives, a Canadian journal of political economy and social democracy. I'm Clement Nokos, editor of Perspectives Journal and director of policy at the Broadbent Institute. On this special episode of the Perspectives Journal podcast, we have for you the 2025 Ellen Meiksins Wood Lecture delivered by British economist and writer Grace Blakeley, author of the 2024 book entitled Vulture Capitalism, Corporate Crimes, Backdoor Bailouts, and the Death of Freedom. She's the recipient of this year's Ellen Meiksins Wood Prize in recognition of her critical analysis of economic systems and neoliberal capitalism that helps movements take back democratic power for the working class. Blakeley reflects on Ellen's rigorously materialist understanding of democracy, illustrating why neoliberal capitalism has overruled democracy and why we must organize to take back democratic power for the working class. Speaking in Canada for the first time, her lecture, Genuine Democracy in an Age of Hyper-Individualism, describes the powerlessness felt across the working class, the causes of these feelings, how the far right is harnessing this disenchantment, and what the left needs to do to win. Liberal technocracy is not the solution, argues Blakeley. You cannot have real democracy in an individualistic society where, rather than collective power, people see themselves as competing with one another in order to get to the top of a rigged economy. The only way to change things is to shatter individualism as an ideology, practice, and set of structures, then figure out how we can work together again. She goes on. Instead of pushing some policy agenda that can be implemented by elites, we need to empower people to take control from the bottom up, not because we don't want to take control of political institutions, but precisely because we do. The lecture is a visionary take on what is needed to reinvigorate left-wing electoral politics in Canada and around the world, and is a useful tool for Canadian progressives in finding our approach to face today's political challenges through organizing. Here's Grace Blakeley speaking on Tuesday, May 20th at Toronto Metropolitan University for the 2025 Ellen Meiksins Wood Lecture.
It is so great to be here with you today in Toronto. It's so great to see so many of you here. And it is such a huge honor to be awarded the Ellen Meiksins Wood Prize. Ellen's work has had a huge impact on me. I would place my writing, my work, in the tradition of political Marxism, which is the school that Ellen really helped to found. And in particular, her understanding of the relationship between capitalism, class, and democracy have deeply informed my thinking and deeply informed my latest book, Vulture Capitalism. And in fact, I quote Ellen's work at length in the introduction to that book. I think Ellen's understanding of democracy, which was a rigorously materialist understanding of democracy, both when you're thinking about, the very first emergence of democratic institutions in Athens, which she insisted needed to be understood from a materialist perspective. We needed to be able to understand the relations of production to be able to figure out what this system meant, all the way through to her analysis of the Industrial Revolution and the emergence of capitalism, which she understood as a historically specific social formation, not an inevitability, all the way through to her understanding of modern politics and the kind of crisis of democracy today. These insights have not only informed my thinking, I think they are incredibly important in understanding what we are experiencing today, which is all across the rich world, a profound crisis of democratic institutions. And that is what I'm going to focus my lecture on today. So the most obvious case of this crisis is, of course, what we're seeing just south of Canada in the US. But this crisis of democracy is happening all over the world. Particularly, when we look at Europe due to the rise of the far right, which uses explicitly anti-democratic rhetoric, which is appealing to an increasing section of the electorate. Democracy is actually losing support across the board, particularly among young people, many of whom are likely to say that they don't believe that democracy works. So what's gone wrong? There was a time when liberal democracy seemed hegemonic, seemed unchallengeable. Liberals were overjoyed at the alleged end of history in the 1990s. This was this moment of euphoria when history was literally seen as over. History is understood as it is in the liberal imaginary as a great battle between ideas. Obviously very different to the Marxist understanding of a battle between different classes. But as part of this liberal understanding of history as this great battle between ideas, the 1990s meant that history was over. Capitalism had won. Capitalism and this specific form of liberal representative democracy were seen as bedfellows. And this was where the rest of the world was going. And then all of a sudden, something changed. Support for democratic institutions, and actually most social institutions, started to ebb after the financial crisis of 2008. And liberals didn't really have a convincing explanation as to why this happened. The most common thing I hear when I'm talking to someone in the kind of liberal tradition as to why we've seen this corrosion of support for democracy is basically to blame social media. The idea being that, people are being brainwashed to dislike democracy. And I think Ellen Meiksins would disagree. I think she would have something to say about that. Because as I've mentioned, her work focused on explaining how democratic institutions emerge from a materialist perspective by analyzing the relations of production, by analyzing how productive forces shape what is going on throughout the rest of society. And I think we need that perspective now more than ever to understand why democracy is under threat. And part of the issue here is, of course, that we don't have real democracy. This is a big part of my argument in Vulture Capitalism. Vulture Capitalism is a book that argues that capitalist societies are actually characterized by a form of oligarchic centralized planning, in which public and private institutions work together to basically kind of plan who gets what. You see that with the centralized planning that takes place within large monopolistic corporations, but also the way in which powerful states work alongside those corporations to consolidate the wealth and power of those at the top. And this is completely contradictory to the way that Ellen Meiksins Wood understood democracy, which was democracy as direct popular power, a powerful force that can be used against capitalism, rather than this limited liberal representative democracy, which too often acts as its servant. So in this lecture, I want to discuss the crisis of liberal democracy and how we might build what Ellen Meiksins Wood would have seen as a genuine democracy, and all the challenges associated with that in this age of hyper-individualism. So how can we understand the current crisis of democracy from a materialist perspective? Well, the first and most obvious candidate is, of course, inequality. In the UK, a few days ago, actually, there was a study that came out showing that the UK's 50 richest families hold more wealth than 50% of the population. And this is kind of contrary to the narrative that we have about in the UK, which is that inequality is stable and it's not so much of a problem, which is obviously completely wrong. And in the US, it's similar. You have the richest 10% controlling 60% of the country's wealth. Meanwhile, poverty is on the rise. So in the UK, we have a record 4.5 million children living in poverty. And again, another stat that came out about the US the other day, 60% of families struggling to afford the essentials. Now, the reason these trends are threatening democracy is that wealth and political power are fungible. Because, as Ellen Meiksins Wood would have reminded us, there is no real separation between the economic and the political under capitalism. And this is a really crucial point, I think, to be able to understand the political Marxist critique of liberal democracy, which is that we don't live in free market democratic societies. We do live in systems of centralized capitalist planning, in which large corporations and powerful states work together to plan who gets what. Now, when this book first came out, when my book first came out, this was a more controversial point to make. Today, it seems pretty obvious when you have, Elon Musk and Donald Trump working together to plan the US empire. But it's not new. This is always the way that capitalism has worked, this form of capitalist planning. It has ebbed and flowed in different ways over the years, but has been a constant feature of capitalism since its inception, all the way back to the East India Company, which was this joint venture between merchants and the British state in pursuit of imperial power. In the book, I give loads of examples of what this looks like today. So the book opens with the example of Boeing. And the 737 MAX disasters, where 2 Boeing planes crashed, killing nearly 350 people. The fact that it was later revealed that Boeing knew about the problems with these planes before they went to market and allowed them to go to market anyway. And the central role of the American state in supporting this company before this crisis, through the crisis, and then after the crisis, showing those intimate links between corporations driven by this pursuit of wealth at all costs and capitalist states driven by a desire to shore up their own wealth and power, and doing so by cooperating with elites and vested interests. I also use some Canadian examples in the book. Particularly, there's a very close relationship, as some of you might know, between one of the world's largest asset managers, BlackRock, and the Canadian state. And now something that Luke, I know, is very familiar with. And now you have our former governor of the Bank of England, Mark Carney, leading this country. These links between the public and private sector, mediated by institutions like central banks, are critical to the way that capitalism functions. And it goes against, I think, the popular understanding of the divide between left and right as this divide between markets and states. And this is what I think Marxists really can bring to our politics, is a recognition and understanding that these two forces are not at odds, that they are in fact working together as part of a capitalist system to consolidate this inequality of power that defines capitalism. What defines capitalism not being free market democracy, but what defines capitalism being a divide between the people who own all the stuff and everyone else who is forced to work for a living, and the organization of society in the interests of the former. So this close cooperation between corporate interests, wealthy individuals, and states shapes very deeply how liberal democracy functions. And this is a big part of the crisis that we're dealing with today. But this isn't the end of the story. As I've illustrated, this cooperation has always existed. This has always been the case. So why is it becoming so much more of an issue now? Why is this crisis of inequality having such a deep and profound impact on our democratic institutions? So first, we're living through a period of kind of low productivity, combined with a series of economic and political crises that have meant that there's less to go around. So more at the top means less for everyone else. The rise of this kind of zero-sum politics of the kind practiced by Trump. So if there's more for me, that means less for you. That's the antithesis of the kind of 90s liberal triumphalist end of history moment of we don't need to kind of fiddle around with the balance of power between different classes because we can just wait for growth and then everything else will follow. This was really what collapsed during the financial crisis of 2008. It's what's collapsed even further during the cost of living crisis. Inflation being one of those really critical trends that enforces this zero-sum mindset of more for you means less for me. Inflation is one of those things that really brings out class conflict because, who pays for inflation is something that is basically often decided, has historically been decided on the streets as part of this battle between workers and bosses. So the rise of this zero-sum politics is really undermining the foundations of that liberal democratic moment, which was based on the idea that growth would basically smooth over that contradiction between workers and bosses. Second, globalization has meant that these inequalities are becoming concentrated in particular places, which means that they have an outsized impact on our politics as they can be effectively leveraged to shift political outcomes. We all know what this looks like. in the rise of, the liberal metropolitan elite discourse that divides peripheries from the centers of our countries. It gave rise to Brexit, for example, the idea of people in left-behind communities giving a bloody nose to the liberal establishment. This is something that we're also seeing in the US and in many other parts of the world. But the final reason that inequality is now creating such a profound crisis for our democratic institutions, and the one that I want to focus on, is that we live in an age of individualism, which makes people feel powerless to challenge those at the top. And there's a story that I want to tell you, something that I experienced a few years ago that I think illustrates actually all of these points. So back in 2019, some of you may know I was fairly integrally involved in the Labour Party under Jeremy Corbyn. And back in 2019, when one of these elections was taking place, when Jeremy Corbyn was leader, I was knocking on doors in these kind of left-behind regions of the UK. I was in a former mining town, speaking to voters, asking them how they would be voting. And I knocked on one particular door, and the occupant kind of opened it slightly suspiciously. And I asked him if he knew how he'd be voting in the upcoming election. And he said, no, he didn't know. Lots of people didn't make their mind up until the last possible moment. So I asked him, what are the issues that you are most concerned about? And he said, well, I'm particularly concerned about the economy. So I was like, great, I'm a policy wonk. I can answer all of your questions about the economic policies in the manifesto. So I listed these policies. And then he comes back looking at me again very suspiciously. How are you going to pay for all that? So I listed that this was a fully costed manifesto, and there would be taxes on the wealthy, and there would be investment that would create growth, et cetera, et cetera. And his answer really stuck with me, his response to that point. He basically said, I've voted Labour my whole life, and they've been in power here for years, so Labour had been in local government in that area for years. They promised the world at election time, and nothing changes. And I didn't really know how to respond, because the Marxist in me was like, yeah, you're right. That is a pretty accurate description of how liberal politics works. And we know why this is from a theoretical perspective. I write all about this in Vulture Capitalism. The capitalist state is, like capital, a social relation. So policy outcomes reflect the balance of class power in society. We've seen this very, very clearly with the most recent Labour government to be elected in the UK. There's a great, really clear example of, I think, how vested interests shaping the policy process has worked, which is that Rachel Reeves promised to come in and deliver a big tax on private equity. This is a great populist policy. These are some of the wealthiest institutions, most powerful institutions in the finance sector. And it would have been a really easy tax that would have affected a very small number of people. And what happened? The private equity industry extremely successfully lobbied to water down these proposals beyond recognition, such that a tax that would have affected a few thousand people ended up being not scrapped, but watered down so substantially that it became unrecognizable. So, we know how this works. I've written extensively about how this works. But that isn't really helpful when you're on the doorstep talking to people about why they should not necessarily just vote for a political party, why they should get engaged in politics at all. I thought a lot about this interaction afterwards, about what this man was feeling and about what the implications were for our politics. And the thing I concluded was that all of his responses could be traced back to a profound sense of powerlessness. Like nothing could ever change, certainly not in the way that this man wanted things to change. This came through in the question, how are you going to pay for it? This was less a question about the kind of intricacies of fiscal policy, and it was more a question about credibility. Why should I believe you that you can do anything good? All the way through to the idea that politicians are all the same. Things for people like me don't tend to change. I think you'll recognize aspects of this story because it's an experience that has been replicated all over the developed world, of places being left behind, of communities being hollowed out, people feeling powerless to arrest those changes, all the way through to the horrifying rise in what some sociologists have called deaths of despair, suicide, alcoholism, that are concentrated in these communities. This issue of powerlessness, I would say, is the defining political emotion of our age. And the far right is beating us in the response. Why? Well, there are two ways that you can respond to powerlessness. And I think, different sides of the political spectrum take these different responses, respectively. There's despair, right? You can say, oh, well, I'm powerless to change things. The world is the way it is. There's nothing I can do about it. I think a lot of people on the left often end up taking this route. I see this extensively among young people today, particularly when it comes to how they take on the climate crisis. Ultimately, it can lead to conspiracism, because conspiracism is a kind of, inverted response to this feeling of those at the top are in complete and utter control, and there's nothing I personally can do about it. There's nothing I can really do to challenge them. But the other way to respond to feelings of powerlessness is anger. People thrash and rage against the constraints imposed upon them and desperately attempt to regain some sense of agency, some sense of power. And often, they regain this sense of political agency by projecting it onto a powerful ruler who promises to come in and bash the political elites who have crushed them and ignored them and undermined them for so long. Thinking about this, response to powerlessness, this rage in response to powerlessness that the far right has capitalized on so effectively, it made me think about the emergence of fascism in Italy. The word comes from this tool that was developed by the Romans, the fasces, which is a bundle of sticks with an axe in the middle. And Mussolini picked up this symbolism. Mussolini, a former socialist, picked up this symbolism. The reason that the fasces is used is because a single stick is very easy to break. But when you bind a bunch of sticks together, they become very difficult to break. When you stick an axe in the middle, they can be used to attack your political enemies. I don't think that it's a coincidence that this bears some similarity to the historic symbol of the trade union movement, which is a raised fist, because you can break one finger quite easily, but you can't break a raised fist. And this, I think, is a really important point to understand the rise of fascism in the context of powerlessness, both today and historically, because in an age when people recognize and realize the coordinated, pervasive power of our political economic elites, but they feel isolated to do anything about it. They feel like that one stick or that one finger. Then a message that says, if you come together, you can be powerful, is very compelling. And the tragedy is that that message, which was historically put forward by the left as part of the labor movement, has been lost. But the right are doing that very effectively. They're saying you need to come together to defend your communities against outsiders. And often there are overtones or undertones of political violence as a part of that. This, I think, is the main issue threatening democracy today. It's not just inequality. It's inequality in the context of the decline of collective power and the rise of individualism. And this, I think, can be traced back again to neoliberalism, something that you may ordinarily associate with changes in economic policy. There was a much more profound and deep project that was at the heart of the neoliberal movement. And it comes through in the quote from Margaret Thatcher when she says, "There's no such thing as society." This wasn't an observation of the society that she found in the 1970s in Britain. That was a statement of intent. One of the most important parts of the neoliberal revolution was breaking up the collective institutions that gave people that sense of community, of power, of solidarity in an economy that was weighted against them, that allowed people to shift the balance of power within society, and so to make politicians pay attention to them, to create those changes within the state in their favor. This was Thatcher taking on the miners. It was Reagan taking on the aircraft traffic controllers. But it was also globalization, leading to hollowed out places where there were once thriving communities that could allow people to engage in political projects. It was the centralization of state power, somewhat ironically for a neoliberal movement that claimed to abhor the state, as I show in Vulture Capitalism. That is very, very far from the truth. Laws against protest, against striking. I think Ellen captured this really effectively with a quote, which is that for all intents and purposes, there is no politics, or at least no legitimate politics, outside Parliament. Indeed, the more inclusive the people has become, the more the dominant political ideologies have insisted on depoliticizing the world outside Parliament and delegitimizing extra-parliamentary politics. Now, this neoliberal attempt to really eviscerate those collective institutions that gave people a sense of belonging, solidarity, power, this was a response to a very particular political moment. There's a French sociologist called Grégoire Chamaillou who wrote a book called The Ungovernable Society. And he observed that in the 1970s, all across the rich world, there was this moment of extraordinary confidence among the working classes. Now, this was obvious in the labor movement, where you had, in the UK, workers coming together to effectively shut down production in this struggle over who was going to be made to pay for inflation. But it was also visible throughout the whole of society. It was visible in the anti-apartheid movement, in the peace movement, in the movements of '68 across Europe. There was this sense that those at the top were losing control. And this is, I think, really critical to understanding how capitalism works. The neoliberals had this narrative, which is that capitalism is a free market system, and we want to reduce the size of the state to create more space for the market. But the way that they actually behaved, which had very little to do with creating free markets, and if you look in the economic sphere, it's actually much more to do with subsidizing vested interest. But in the realm of society, their project was really to take down these forms of collective power and create an ideology of the market that encouraged us to believe that we all had to compete against one another to get to the top. I really take down in the book the neoliberal ideology that says we want to create free market systems by showing that most of their policy proposals did anything but. They actually ended up creating forms of kind of corporate corruption and centralization that were antithetical to the original ideas of people like, for example, Hayek. But the ideology of the market, the idea that society should be made to resemble a market system in which you couldn't have forms of collective organizing because that would undermine the functioning of the market, which requires us all to see ourselves as these isolated, atomized individuals competing against one another to get to the top. And if you do get to the top, it's because you are a high-value individual. If you don't get to the top, it's because you are a low-value individual. Don't blame the system, blame yourself. And this was an ideology that was really, pushed in a number of different ways. There was the obvious use of force. So Thatcher literally sending the police against striking miners. But there were much more subtle ways in which this ideology was pushed. We stopped referring to workers. Workers instead were understood as mini entrepreneurs. This was really epitomized. It reached its apogee with the rise of the gig economy, right? Where you are no longer an employee of Uber. You are a little firm. You buy your own inputs and outputs. But it was also evident in the kind of neoliberalization of education, where you have your individual human capital. And it's okay for you to take out a loan to invest in your education because you are going to reap the long-term returns from that investment in your human capital over the long run. You are not a worker, you are a small business. And everyone in that sense is drawn in to the capitalist system, because your fate as an entrepreneur is, in some senses, tied to the performance of financial markets. And this is, again, epitomized by the creation of home-owning democracies and the privatization of pensions, so that you as a worker, your fate is tied to the ups and downs of capital markets. And you can be encouraged and convinced not to come together with other workers to demand increases in your wages, but instead to compete with those around you and to understand the performance of your portfolio as a representation of your effectiveness as a little entrepreneur. Workers became entrepreneurs. Citizens were no longer understood as citizens participating in a public sphere. They came to be understood as consumers of public services. And the median voter would attempt to maximize their utility by voting for the political party whose policy program most neatly represented their interests and preferences. And in that sense, you had the technocratization of politics, the loss of the sense of politics as a struggle between different interest groups, and instead the rise of this form of politics that I think someone like Mark Carney really epitomizes, which is the idea that it is a choice between different policies that can basically be assessed through the discipline of economics to determine which policy is the best. And it just so happens that the best policies tend to be the ones that actually work in the interests of those at the top. Citizens become consumer of public services. Communities, instead of being represented as communities, become isolated households. There was a whole movement within neoliberal economics to say that failing places should be allowed to fail, and those resources should be more effectively redistributed to allow for the proper, efficient functioning of markets across geographical places. And instead of these thriving communities, which were the foundations in many places of the labor movement, you have isolated individual households that learn to compete against one another to survive. And today we are so busy competing with each other that we have forgotten how to work together to change the rules. And that is why we all feel so powerless. And I think this is a real shift. Represents a real challenge because it's a real shift from how society looked when the left first emerged. You know, the workers coming together to form the first unions and fight for their right to organize and fight for democracy itself, they faced objectively far greater challenges than we do today, but they had a sense of their ability to work together to change things. And that's what we lost in the 1980s. So how can we fight back? Well, as Ellen Meiksins Wood would have argued, we need real democracy. And as I would argue, you cannot have real democracy in an individualistic society where rather than collective power, people see themselves as competing with one another in order to get to the top of a rigged economy. The only way to really change things is to shatter individualism as an ideology, as a practice, as a set of structures, and figure out how we can work together again. Stop asking, what can I do? And start asking, what can we do? Our job on the left isn't just to explain why capitalism isn't working. I can give complex theoretical explanations of the links between public and private power under capitalism. But what I found when talking about this book with normal people is that most people already know this. They know that big businesses are in bed with government. That's basically what the guy was telling me on the doorstep all those years ago. They don't need us to explain why. The issue is that they feel powerless to change things. Why? Because you can't change things on your own. And that is how people feel, completely on their own. The reason that I started investigating these problems around individualism and isolation and powerlessness is because when I was going around promoting vulture capitalism, I spoke to a lot of young people, and they would be really enthused by the ideas that I was talking about in the book, and particularly the final section where I discuss these examples of kind of democratic planning at the grassroots level, because their worldview is so shaped by individualism that the idea of coming together to build different ways of living, to challenge the power of capital, is so alien to them. They're used to going to talks, book talks about politics, and the end point is a list of policies that could be implemented, or even worse, a set of consumption decisions that you can make to be a good ethical consumer that isn't directly contributing to the issues that we've talked about. So I think this challenge of individualism has become so rooted, particularly in the minds of young people who've never really lived without it. And it's also why there is this profound sense of isolation. And all the young people, particularly, Gen Z people who I've spoken to, who have begun to participate in forms of collective organizing that have brought them together with other like-minded people, whether that's as part of a union, whether it's as part of a protest movement, or, a climate movement, or anything. The one thing that they speak about, the thing that they all have in common, is, yes, this sense of collective joy, but also the need that they didn't realize they had for connection and belonging that is met through participation in these social institutions. And that's really why I think today the job of the left has to be to help us to rebuild those forms of collective power. Now, there was a time when this was kind of, these forms of collective organizing that were taking place on the grassroots were dismissed as folk politics. And there was this shift on the left to say, look, we need to refocus on institutions. And I think that was important. It was right. It was the foundations for what we saw in the 2010s of the rise of leftist movements in which I was involved. But those institutionalist projects all failed because they didn't have that base that could shift the balance of power in society to build power. If the left wants to influence political institutions, we need to be able to understand this idea of the state as a social relation, this Marxist idea that can be traced back through someone like Ellen Meiksins Wood, but also Ralph Miliband, all the way back to Gramsci, and say, how do we build popular power in order to allow people to take back control over their lives so that they can become engaged in these forms of politics? And I think this actually requires a shift in our own ways of thinking about politics, because I think there's a sense in which we have absorbed an individualistic approach to politics. I see this a lot of people on the left seeing ourselves as heroes, saving victims. I think this is what that man who I spoke to on the doorstep was really cynical about, because it feeds into a lack of agency. If you approach someone and say, I'm here to save you, that feeds into that very sense of powerlessness that is at the root of their political alienation to begin with. So I think this is the challenge that we face today. We need to abandon the politics of hero and victims and start empowering working people to, in the words of the Brexiteers, take back control of their own lives. And if you think about it, this is the only way that the left has ever won political change in the past. Left politics did not emerge from clever leftist intellectuals going to working class communities and saying, have you considered forming a union to shift the balance of power away from capital and towards labor? No, left politics emerged out of people's struggles for a better life. Instead of pushing some policy agenda that can be implemented by elites, we need to empower people to take control from the bottom up. Not because we don't want to take control of political institutions, but precisely because we do. And I think our understanding of our mission needs to change. Instead of slogans like tax the rich or Green New Deal now, which, by the way, I'm entirely in favor of, but how is someone who's hearing that message going to respond? How do I engage with a political project whose mission is basically a set of policies that's going to be implemented by elites? And instead, I think we need to focus as well on empowering people to take control in their communities, in their workplaces, and on the streets. I think we need to be reminding people that political change isn't something that is going to be delivered from the outside, that that's not how democracy, as people like Ellen Meiksins Wood understood it, works. It's going to come from their efforts to change their own lives. And our slogan, I think, has to change. It has to look something along the lines of organize, because nobody is coming to save us. Thank you.
That was Grace Blakeley, UK-based economist and writer, and the recipient of the 2025 Ellen Meiksins Wood Prize. You can share, read, and watch the full lecture at perspectivesjournal.ca. And if you like this lecture, share and subscribe to Perspectives, a Canadian journal of political economy and social democracy, on all major podcast platforms, as well as Press Progress's award-winning Sources podcast that digs deeper into the news stories you won't find in the major papers. The Perspectives Journal podcast and Sources are proud members of the Harbinger Media Network, Canada's progressive podcast community. And you can read more in Perspectives Journal, a publication of the Broadbent Institute, by visiting perspectivesjournal.ca.